Yeah, my name's Megan Poxon, and I finished my MSc in cancer biology in September 2021. I had a really nice experience. I think I liked the fact that, particularly when moving to a new city, I liked that the city wasn't that big and all of the buildings were fairly close together because I got very lost at the start. And I also liked that you were assigned a personal tutor. That really helped, again, particularly at the start, whilst I was getting used to studying at a degree level. And then when it came to studying my master's, I chose to stay at HALLAM for a number of reasons. I liked the science department. I liked the way that they reinforce sort of the practical skills as well as the theoretical skills. And that's definitely helped when it came to applying to jobs after finishing my master's, because they really enjoyed the fact that I had a placement year, and I'd had lots of time in the lab, as well as having the background knowledge. My placement was during my BSc in biomedical science. It seemed like a lot of the lecturers there were very well renowned within the Sheffield scientific community. So I was able to name drop, I guess, a few times, which was also very helpful. And particularly the research projects that I'd done under these supervisors, they seemed to really be interested in hearing about what I'd undertaken during those projects, and what I'd found. And they just really, again, liked the fact that my practical skills were up there, and so real life applications were massively helpful. I was definitely able to draw the skills that I'd learned during my BSc and MSc at HALLAM, and apply them to the role that I'm doing at the moment, and I'll be able to further apply them when I start my PhD this year. For me, it was just after I'd started my project in my master's. So it was around April time when I thought, okay, I need to sort of plan my next steps. I knew, unlike your degree where you finish in May, I had until September to figure out a plan of action. So I knew I had a good sort of 5 months to have a look around and decide what I wanted to do. Because at that point, I wasn't sure whether I did want to do a PhD or go into clinical research. So I was kind of just putting feelers out to get an idea as to what was out there and what I could apply to and what I was interested in. And if there was anything where I could directly sort of use the skills that I'd got from my master's and apply those. And luckily for me, this was the second job I applied to and I was successful. Yeah, I actually booked an appointment with one of the careers advisors when I wasn't sure what jobs I could apply to, as the job specs were very vague a lot of the time. A lot of them did ask for a science related degree, but they were also sort of, especially for the clinical roles, I wasn't sure whether, because I'd never worked in a clinical environment, I was able to apply for those kind of roles. But luckily the careers advisor spoke me through sort of the job applications themselves, as well as the specs and sort of what to look out for. And they also taught me how to twist the research that I'd done, even though it wasn't directly clinical, it was more academic research, and make it so that they understood that I could apply that to a clinical role. And that was really useful in sort of expanding what I thought I could apply to. As initially, I thought I was very limited to sort of academic research, but she was very helpful in helping me get into the clinical side. I was very lucky, even after being unsuccessful in that role, in that they called me to talk me through why I wasn't successful, and sort of recommendations for when I applied to my next role. And one of the massive things they said was the person who was successful had emailed them and asked if they could have a tour of the department, and sort of did that step above just putting their application in. They made it so that they were very interested and eager to work in that department. So then when I applied to this role, I took that on board and I emailed the head of the department and asked whether I could have a quick tour and whether it would be okay for me to talk to the person who was already in that role and get an idea as to what the job would involve. And they said that that was really useful in my application, because it said to them that I wasn't just applying randomly. I was actually thinking about my applications and really sort of getting to know the role before I applied. This was after I'd put my application in, but before I knew whether I had an interview or not. So they seemed very happy to show people around who were interested, whether they knew that they'd got round to the next stage or not. But then when it came to my interview, I could also draw from my time looking around the department, and that definitely helped me answer some of the questions that they were asking as well, because the person who was in the role currently, who was leaving, sort of talked me through her daily activities and her application process, and so I was able to bring that into the interview, and that definitely helped. The interview process wasn't as scary as I initially thought it was going to be. They seemed more interested in what I could bring versus what I actually knew of the department. Because I had no clinical experience, I actually knew very little about the process of clinical research. But they seemed to just want me to understand whether I would be able to do that role versus if I knew what the role entailed. I did a bit of reading around the department itself and the trials that they were running. So I knew that there was some oncology ones. So I was able to talk about my oncology knowledge from my master's. And then I drew from my lab experience that I knew how to work to strict protocols and work safely in a lab. But then I also used even little roles, like I worked at the COVID testing clinic and sort of tried to draw from that and say that I was good at working as part of a team working towards the same goal. And they asked me about databases, and I hadn't particularly used databases all that much. So for that one, I just basically tried to say I used to store a lot of data and send a lot of data, even if I wasn't directly involved in the data process itself. I think one of the things that I'd always struggled with was if I have a high workload, I try and do it all at once, all at the same time, and get it all done. Whereas I've learned that that's not always possible. And sometimes you do have to either delegate and ask for help, or some things you can just prioritize and leave it for the next day, leave it for the next week. It doesn't all have to be done there and then. And so I think one of the biggest skills that I think I've had to employ and learn to use better is prioritizing my workload and trying not to get overwhelmed if I have a lot on, and there's always another day to do it. I would say try and draw as much experiences as you can from it as possible. I think my placement year was the best decision that I ever made in terms of my next steps, even my master's after that, and getting this job and getting my PhD. I think it all came down to having those extra experiences outside of your degree, because unfortunately a lot of people have degrees nowadays and have really good degrees nowadays. It's about the extra things that you've done, the extracurricular stuff that you've done, the hobbies that you've done. I think they just like to see that you're a well-rounded person, and you have lots of aspects to you. I think for me, I wanted to explore other things before I dedicated to a PhD, as I understand that it's a very big commitment. It's a very long commitment. And so I wanted to really make sure that I'd looked at other things as well before I dedicated myself to the PhD, and I've really enjoyed this job, and it's been really nice to do something different to what I'd done before, and I think it has added to my skill set, and it's probably further prepared me for starting my PhD. Definitely, because it's just that next step above a master's. It's a lot of work, and it's been very stressful, but I think it's made me better at handling high workloads, and all in all, I think it's made me more prepared for doing my PhD now. Well, during this role, I actually spoke to a few of my colleagues about their experiences, because a lot of them either didn't even have scientific backgrounds and had come into the clinical side, and others had explored other things before coming into this, and some were the same as me and doing this until they knew for sure what they wanted to do next. And I had a really helpful conversation with one of the nurses actually, who had said, oh, have you ever thought about medical communications? And it was a role that I'd never even heard of before. And so I went home and had a little look, and it turns out for that you need a PhD, but it was also, I think this role's made me realize that I miss the academic research. I miss working in the lab, and I miss the challenge of trying to figure out a puzzle. And so, yeah, I think that's what sort of drew me round to doing my PhD now. I think I'm ready for it. So my PhD is with the MRC Diamond program. So it works a little bit differently to a lot of the traditional PhDs, as funding comes attached to the project. So with the Diamond program, I think it's around 40 projects each year get funded by 5 universities. And so luckily for me, I didn't have to apply for the funding, but because the funding's attached, it's quite a competitive program, because it's sort of like the perfect route. But I know people who have applied for PhDs the traditional way, and although it's hard to get funding, they want to get funding. So as long as they think that you're a good fit for the project, the funding will come. But unfortunately, I don't have the experience of applying for funding, so I won't be too helpful there. But the Diamond Project was one that I'd not heard of before, so I definitely look into that as well. And so my friend who had applied for PhDs last year, straight out of her master's, had come across the Diamond Project through I think it was one of her lecturers had mentioned it to her. And again, she hadn't heard of it before. And so this year when I said, oh, I think I'm going to apply for a PhD this year, she mentioned it to me. And so I had a look, and luckily there was a project that I really liked. So I went for it that way. All of your fees covered, so your laboratory costs and things like that. And then you also get a living stipend. It's around 16,000. So it's definitely enough to live off like semi-comfortably in terms of a lot of funding, which isn't as nice. But yeah, so you get everything covered. And there's also an option to apply for extra funding if you want to do a 3-month out of lab placement, as it were. And I know people that have gone abroad for their little placements, and they cover all of the costs as well as living costs if you choose to do that. So there's lots of opportunities to apply for extra funding if you want to do other things as well. The set requirements involved a 2-1 or above in a science-related degree. I think they prefer you to have a master's as well, just because it shows that you can work to that next level. And it means you've probably got a couple of research projects under your belt as well, so you understand the process of a project. But for me, I think they said what made me again stand out was the placement and the fact that I'd done extra things outside of my degree. I think they just want to know that you are going to see it through and you're interested and you're dedicated, because 4 years is a long time to just study one thing. So I think as long as you're really interested in what you want to study and they see that come across, the rest is all standard as long as you've got your degree. I think it's more, they just want to know that you're a right fit for the project.